This is podcast 1 of Chapter 11, Assessment in the Instructional Process. Although assessment has always been a part of the instructional process, it has in recent years taken its place with planning as an essential part of the process. The recent focus on assessment in the instructional process integrates assessment into the learning process and emphasizes more authentic and meaningful assessment materials. The increased use of the standards as part of student, teacher, and program accountability by states, districts, and schools has also increased the need for teachers to be skilled in the design and the use of assessment. The role of assessment now in physical education in the instructional process is very important. It's almost a key to what we do. The NASB standards, of which there are 5 now, call for assessment and accountability at all levels. Although physical education is not a core subject, do we have to assess students? Yes, we do. Even though we are not accountable to the principal for assessment results and data and to the general public, in other words, physical education results and fitness testing results don't go on a school's report card. Even though that doesn't happen, we're accountable to the students and the parents for what they're actually learning in physical education. One of the problems with roll out the ball programs right now is that they don't assess students and they don't keep track of their progress over time. They just essentially roll out the ball and have a nice, organized, recreational program. We don't want recreational programs. We want students to actually learn something. There is an increased use of assessment to guide the instructional process. In other words, taking the results of assessment of students and trying to look at that and see how you can change instruction in the next lesson or two or within the unit to make it so that students will learn better. You need to determine where the students are at a particular point in time in relation to an intended outcome. You should have learned this in your 590 assessment class, but just as a review, the definition of terms is important to know because there is a huge difference between assessment and evaluation. Many people and many teachers, in fact, get these two terms mixed up. Assessment is the process of gathering information to make a judgment about the products and processes of instruction. It's the gathering of the information. It is not the judgments that we make. Evaluation is the use of the information to make a judgment about the products or process of instruction. Until information is translated into an actual judgment, it is assessment and not evaluation. There are obviously several purposes for assessment in physical education. One is that it provides students with information on their progress. You give them pre-tests, you give them post-tests, and you compare the results to see if they're learning or they're gaining the information they need. It's also used to motivate students to improve their performance. In other words, an accountability for the students, not just the teachers, but trying to make them more accountable for their own learning. It's also used to judge the effectiveness of your own teaching and of the programs that you're teaching in. It also provides teachers with information to adjust instruction. If students didn't understand a particular concept and you can tell that on a written exam, then you need to reteach that content or re-emphasize it in some way during your instruction. Assessment is also used to evaluate our curriculum and our programs. Usually that's done under what we call program evaluation and not so much student types of tests. We also use assessment to group students by ability. That's one thing that we did at Nation Ford in the tennis unit. We decided to give them a national tennis rating performance assessment, a self-assessment, and they decided how they did according to what those different levels were. Then we took all of the 4.0 students and put them into a group, all the 3.5 students and put them into a group, etc., etc. That's how we group them by ability. The most obvious purpose of assessment is for grading. People use assessments for grading, but we need to make sure that the assessments that we're using are valid and reliable to determine grades. We don't want peer assessments to be used for grading. Choosing assessments to use obviously depends on the purpose of what you're going to use the assessment for. Assessments in physical education are used for information on student progress, for motivating students, for the effectiveness of teaching, for the current status of students to adjust instruction, to evaluate the curriculum or the program, to place students in groupings, or obviously for grading purposes. If you are using an assessment to motivate students, many times it's better to use formative assessments that don't have a product or whatever to try to motivate them to get better. Although some students are motivated better by competition and numbers and actual things that are written down on a piece of paper. It just depends on your students as well as the purpose of what you're going to use this assessment for. Formative assessment, as you may remember from 590, is process-oriented, or assessment that happens during learning. An example is a peer assessment where a student would have a rubric for the overhead serve in volleyball, and they would have several critical elements and they would be ranking them according to how well the student did as they observe. A summative assessment is a product-oriented assessment, and it is assessment at the end of learning. An example of that would be a volleyball overhead serve skills test, in which they got certain numbers for the areas of the court that they served the ball into. How are formative and summative assessment different from each other? Well, mainly because in a formative assessment, you're just gathering the information and giving it to the student to try to give them improvement. Summative is usually for some type of judgment, like a grade or whether someone's going to get tenure or not. Another way of putting it for formative assessment is that it's assessment that attempts to assess progress toward a goal in order to make adjustments in the learning process. It's an ongoing process. Most formative assessment has a primary goal of making the assessment part of the learning process, to make assessment an actual learning experience for students. There's many ways you can use assessments during your teaching and during each lesson to help students with learning. Other purposes of formative assessment are motivation, evaluating teaching, adjustment of instruction, and placing students into groups. Instruction does become more meaningful and more personalized for learners when they are involved in both goal setting and assessment. When used regularly, formative assessment for students, the students are more motivated to achieve and are more focused on their learning. Teachers need to continually assess student progress toward the program and unit objectives. Why? In order to make appropriate adjustments in instruction to make instruction more appropriate and meaningful. The idea is that you have to write objectives in your plan, you design learning tasks in your plan, then you go out to teach, you present these tasks to the students, you observe and analyze the students, and then you take that data and as an assessment and you try to apply it to your next lesson. Again, it's kind of the reflective cycle. Now we'll talk a little bit more about summative assessment. As defined, it measures the degree to which objectives have been achieved. In fact, all assessment in teaching is to try to measure the degree to which the objectives have been achieved. It's conducted at the conclusion or the end of a lesson or a unit of instruction. That's why we call it summative. It's a summary of what's happened in that lesson or in that unit. It's used primarily to measure achievement and to compare students with others or a defined standard, a criterion, established by the teacher. It holds students accountable for it holds teachers accountable for student outcomes, but it also holds students accountable for student outcomes. That's the end of Podcast 1 of Chapter 11.